Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. So the work that I'll be talking about today is based on my master's thesis, which was about the preservation movement for the African burial ground. And then after I finished it, of course, I had all these other questions and other sorts of ideas. So this is a part of that work, but also kind of thinking about different theoretical frameworks than I did when I first did it. All right. This question and plea was constantly posed to the leadership of the New York City African Burial Ground Project throughout the 1990s preservation movement to memorialize this historic site. Today, it's repeated several times a day in the introductory film at the African Burial Ground Visitor Center. And the exhibit seems to shout back, "Yes, we will show the bones," with a large concave light box featuring individual photographs of 419 intact or partial skeletons nestled in coffin-shaped depressions in the soil. While working as an educator at the African Burial Ground National Monument in 2010, I took note of the ways in which visitors reacted to this display, whose illumination, size, and location at the beginning of the exhibition suggests its narrative and experiential significance. Children were often frightened, some intrigued. A few adults winced and hurried to the next section, but many, perhaps most, lingered there. What unique emotional charge and/or educative clarity or educative charge and emotional clarity did the representation of skulls and bones contain? In other words, why must we show the bones? Some answers may lie in the theoretical conceptualizations of the dead body, which have included embodiment theory, materiality, semiotics. These both and not quite ways of understanding must be thought alongside the racialization that often exceeds life itself. So the excavated ancestral remains from the African burial ground are emblematic of the relationship and tension between affect and evidence enmeshed in our discourses around Black deaths, particularly those that become known to the public. On one hand, the dead bodies of Black people index racist necropower. They are convincingly adduced as a result They are convincingly adduced as the result of overexposure to violence, historic and current. Elizabeth Alexander and others have even argued that the dead or injured bodies embody Black collectivity and continuity, although fostered in anti-Black trauma. But on the other hand, I ask if overemphasizing what archaeologist Zoe Crossland calls, quote, the dead body as evidence reinscribes violence. Does thinking of the dead bodies of Black people through evidentiary logics, even if generated within Black communities and for politically motivated aims to teach or to adjudicate, contradict or complicate demands for dignity and respect? Further, in deploying and witnessing this evidence, how does the primacy of sight prefigure the representation and repetition of violence? After all, we all know the saying, seeing is believing. But what if we already know? So I am, hopefully this will come back. Oh, there we go. As many of you know, the African Burial Ground is a 6.6 acre cemetery that today still remains beneath the surface of New York City. It's close to City Hall, Wall Street, and the Manhattan side of the Brooklyn Bridge entrance. And it entombs an estimated 10 to 20,000 people. Historians have approximated that it was used as early as the 1640s when the first enslaved Africans in colonial New York semi-successfully petitioned for manumission. They were granted land outside of the colony, known as the Land of the Blacks, and for over 150 years, the burial ground was the foundational spiritual and social institution for a diverse community of early Black New Yorkers, which included both free and enslaved men, women, and children. Once a vital institution, the municipal government of the city of New York declared the burial ground at capacity in 1794, claiming a need for, quote, commercial, public, industrial, and residential space in an expanding city. And so the cemetery was leveled and filled with landfill, and the memory of the African burial ground eventually faded with the passing of generations. In 1991, however, construction workers unearthed human remains during the excavations for the Ted Weiss Federal Building, and a diverse group of activists, primarily of African descent, immediately organized to demand that the U.S. General Services, the GSA, who is the federal agency who purchased the land from the city of New York. So this group of activists demanded that they halt construction immediately and cease the disturbance of graves. And after a year of a racialized power struggle, the two parties reached what most have called a compromise, in which GSA completed the federal office tower that is there now at 290 Broadway, but they agreed to fund the African Burial Ground Project, as it was known at that time. And the promise was to do the following: to establish a public education office to disseminate information as it was being discovered, to conduct a reburial ceremony, to erect a memorial, and this is another slide of a rendition of the memorial. And these are the ones that I'll emphasize. The creation of a museum to present the story of the burial ground and the historic presence of Black people in New York City. But before all of the others, the African Burial Ground Project necessitated a multidisciplinary scientific investigation on the exhumed bodies and grave goods. So again, I'll focus on these last two deliverables because for me, they really represent the reliance on the dead body to produce knowledge. They're also closely related in that the research findings are now presented in the museum exhibition, which really highlights the ultimate goal of the science and the scientists who are involved in the project, which was to engage the public and to ultimately share this knowledge that was produced. However, the necessity, the appropriateness, and the extent of the science was not only fervently contested between the descendant community and the GSA, it was also a sort of contention amongst an ideologically varied activist group. A strong contingency within the descendant community opposed any scientific inquiry, insisting that any research constituted further objectification of the ancestors and desecration of the sacred site. For those opposed to research, the dead body's potential for evidence was far less important than restoration. For them, immediate reburial or repatriation to Africa was the only choice. Nevertheless, most of the defendants, including, this might just keep happening, most of the descendants, including those who occupied influential academic and political positions, argued that the exhumed remains offered unprecedented possibilities to physically detail Black experiences in early New York. Moreover, the descendants hinged their demands for justice on their claims as descendants. and as descendants and their claims as descendants were hinged on this proof that would be yielded from scientific and historical investigation. So, the researchers themselves were a part of the descendant community, primarily the research was led by anthropologists, archaeologists, historians of African descent, and they strategically leveraged epistemology on the behalf of the larger group. And Alondra Nelson traces the social life of DNA back to the science of the African burial ground, when this burgeoning technology with DNA was promised to more precisely and more scientifically reconcile African Americans with our African heritage. So, research director Michael Blakey and his team implemented a research design that centered bioarchaeology, but also incorporated other scientific modes that also foreground the dead body as evidence. They aimed to determine the geographical origins of the population, the physical quality of life. They wanted to theorize African American ethnogenesis, and they wanted to extrapolate data on resistance to slavery. And all of these aims hinged on these physical human remains. So these research objectives epitomize what Crossland calls the evidentiary concepts of the body, which presupposes that the corpse or the skeleton is the paragon of proof. She argues that in medicine, criminology, and law, and forensic anthropology, the dead body is used to, 1, substantiate claims of the past, especially in regard to nationality, ethnicity, and to other types of group identity, and to determine 2, to determine the individual identity of a person. 3, to retroactively diagnose symptoms and ailments and experienced during life, and lastly, to prove a crime. This concept, if expanded to the African burial ground context, is instructive for thinking about the political and epistemological stakes of science, history, and representation. So here, for the first part of the concept, the skeletal remains prove the existence of Black people in large numbers much earlier in New York than was conventionally thought in the 1990s for most people. The bones more than symbolized a transgenerational Black collectivity. Even if considered an indirect connection, the bones affirm the ancestor-descendant relationship by providing physical continuity between African peoples of the past, the activists of African descent in the 1990s, and those who visit and feel connected to the site today. And Catherine McKittrick describes the burial ground as a space that imbricates time, or where time is collapsing. Kara Kempetic argues that the bones have the capacity to, quote, make the past present in ways far more salient and consequential than notions of heritage or acts of commemoration can often accommodate. Now, if you watch as many television crime dramas as I do, perhaps identification is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about the dead body as evidence. But the burial ground researchers found no legible documentation of names or dates, so they assigned each burial a number and used the bones and artifacts to create a profile for each of the disinterred ancestral remains. The details So the details, even if approximated, did the work of individualizing to the extent possible. While the bones often revealed a harsh life and premature death, the grave goods were fodder for conjecture about the person's wealth or status as free or enslaved, or intimated other personal details of that person's life. As the research sought to personalize, it simultaneously diagnosed the harsh conditions of Black life in colonial New York. The physical trauma was legible on the bones, revealing, for example, malnutrition, lead exposure, and sometimes particular causes of death. For example, burial number 328 was a young woman, possibly in her early 20s, whose femurs revealed a short life replete with heavy lifting. Burial 25 was a young woman who, and the musket ball that likely ended her life was still lodged in her rib cage. The bodies of the long dead Black people were adduced to indict the crimes of slavery, racism, and colonialism, and their anti-Black inheritances, which many argued underscored the political movement to preserve the site. And so that is the last of the conceptual frameworks to prove a crime. So despite the elucidating results of the research, I actually want to return to the descendants who fervently opposed scientific study. They force us to grapple with pertinent questions such as, is employing human remains as evidence unavoidably objectifying? The museum's exhibition, which presents the research findings to the public, is now open. It was the final tenet of the compromise, and it opened in 2010. And that was nearly 20 years after the burial ground had been rediscovered. The exhibition rehashes this question of evidence, adding to it visual representations of Black death and the potential of harm via witnessing, alongside the promise of revealing, capital T, the truth, in particular about slavery. The very concept of evidence indexes a need to know, to teach, or to seek justice, but does wanting to know necessitate having to show? So we can also consider in our current moment how cell phone video, police body cams, dash cams, and now Facebook Live feeds have captured the moment of death for Black victims of murder. These images do not only document, they are replayed, they're shared, they're reposted, and they are, I would argue, enacting a repetitive sort of violence, often in the name of future plans for recourse, or simply to show what we, as Black people, already know about the Black vulnerability to violence. So to be clear, I don't want to eschew the effective charge associated with dead bodies or the tactical use of the dead body of evidence to teach and for institutional retribution. And of course, obscuring the bodies can often result in a dangerous erasure. However, in addition to these risks, the reliance on seeing the evidence and the potential of representation, I also want to think about the attendant analytical and political blind spots. So if we have to see, what are those blind spots that come along with that? So Carla F.C. Holloway suggests that because of the politics of Black death in the U.S., mourning has been transformed into a different kind, quote, a different kind of memorialization, as it recognizes specific evidence of racialized violence done to Black bodies. But privileging the dead body as evidence conflates grief with grievance, as Raja Camila Williams points out in her work on Black maternal grief. Perhaps her use of grief as an analytic. Perhaps her use of grief as an analytic can be applied to collective grief, and so that's something that I'm quite interested in. That would certainly provoke us to reconceptualize perhaps justice broadly, or what constitutes a successful recourse in the context of injustice. It may dislodge tropes that overdetermine what is intelligible as premature death and who is legible as victims and perpetrators. Decentering the dead body as evidence might bring less spectacular forms of violence to the fore, tasking activists and mourners to organize around victims of violence who are less legible because their deaths are not witnessed by sight. So we can think about intimate partner violence, for example. Or we can also think about deaths that result from slower iterations of harm to which Black people are exposed due to environmental, economic, and health disparities. These demand attention but resist the evidentiary ease. We'd also perhaps have to rescript the ways in which Black histories are narrativized through death. Here, I'm thinking about museums of African American history and culture that consolidate edutainment and belonging through objects and images. And finally, it perhaps warrants us to rethink the empirical. And referencing Dion Brand, Christina Sharp asserts blackened knowledge as an unscientific method. And I'll leave there because I think for me that's especially provocative for those of us who are doing scholarship in the nexus of Black studies and social science. So I invite thoughts about how to combine blackened knowledge and perhaps a pseudoscientific method.